Welcome. We have a guest speaker today, a very, what I would call well-known author, but a very interesting Canadian colleague of mine in the identity and the blockchain space, who has joined us today. His name's Tim Bouma. He's actually done some very interesting work in Canada, and he is also an accomplished author. So looking forward to the next book, Tim. Thank you for sharing a snippet of that. And
Yeah, that's great.
welcome to the spring semester of most people's senior semester in their digital concentration at NYU in the integrated marketing program.
Yeah, that's great. Can you hear me okay? Am I
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
good? Okay, I'm just so this session is your session. I've got lots of material, more than enough material to talk about anything. And so I think before I launch in anything, I can do like a generic briefing on blockchain. I can talk about digital identity. I can talk about self-sovereign identity. I can talk about policy development. I can talk about you name it. I just want to make sure I don't become a talking head, and I just want to maybe Mark, you could just give me a sense of what your students want, and I want this to be a like an interactive session. I've got lots of material I can talk off the top of my head, and quite happy to speak about anything. So
yeah, I think it would be great, Tim, to start out with. I'd sort of like to do a little bit of a self-introduction about your
sure.
journey, and I think in particularly what students are always interested in about is like what were some of the really interesting pivot points in your career or decision points that were sort of very meaningful, because they actually learn quite a bit from that, and just sort of like what got you to where you are.
Sure. Okay. Again, my name is Tim Bouma. I'm currently a senior analyst with Treasury Board Secretariat with the Government of Canada, and Treasury Board Secretariat is very similar to the Office of Management Budget in the White House. We are a central agency, and we oversee government, if you will. We set policy, administrative policy for all the major departments and agencies, and we work very closely like with the Privy Council office, which is kind of like the executive office of the president in the States. It's a little bit of different structure. I've been at Treasury Board Secretariat as a public servant proper for 10 years. My 10th anniversary is coming up. Actually, yeah, it's coming up this fall. But prior to that, the bulk of my career, I would say the first half of my career was in the private sector. I was in management consulting, was working for one of the big IT companies, CGI, kind of like an Accenture or a PricewaterhouseCoopers. Did a lot of work for the federal government. And prior to that, I was in the software industry as a product manager, product marketing manager. Worked for a company. This was in the pre-Google days when it wasn't called search, it was called text retrieval. It was a company called Fulcrum, and we did text retrieval software for like law firms, the big online providers at the time, Microsoft Network, CompuServe. I don't want to date myself too much, but been in this business, I guess, in the software and the IT industry since the mid 90s. And then switched my focus to government as in management consulting back in the 2000s. And they liked the work I was doing on digital identity or identity management back then. I was asked to come in on executive interchange, and I just coming into the public service, realizing it's a whole different perspective, and I really enjoyed it, and could see where I could make a meaningful difference, and decided to become a full-time public servant. So where I am now, as I said, in Treasury Board Secretariat, I'm part of the cybersecurity division. My focus is digital identity. I have been writing, I've been the principal author for the the policy instruments, the Treasury Board policy instruments on identity, and I've written several of the supporting guidelines. If you're familiar with like NIST guidelines, or actually back to the White House, the Office of Management Budget, where they issue memos, that's kind of the stuff that I was responsible for. So, you know, when you're writing those type of instruments, you got to do a heck of a lot of research and a heck of a lot of consultation. You got to understand stuff inside out and backwards, and you got to be able to synthesize it into very clear and simple requirements, so that when you put together directives or requirements for departments and agencies to implement, you better know what the hell you're talking about. You just can't, it just can't be just word salad. You just can't put stuff together and expect people to understand it. You have to understand it yourself. So that's my background. Maybe I kind of jumped all over the place, but I consider myself like a generalist. I have a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Waterloo. It's kind of like the equivalent of the MIT. I also have an MBA from Master of Business Administration from the University of Ottawa. And, you know, in my spare time, I actually wrote a book, a historical novel, and I published that a couple of years ago on a Canadian landscape artist. And I do have a podcast that I started up a couple months ago on digital identity. And I
By
just
the way,
finished.
the book that you wrote, I think the architect's last name was Thompson. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was really interesting. I took a completely different approach for writing a book. Can I do screen share here?
Yes, you can. It's right in the
Yeah.
bottom of your screen.
Yeah. Okay.
I was reading about this. It's quite an interesting, very interesting approach, right? You started with social media.
Yeah, I started back in 2011, and the bright idea, I think you have to enable screen sharing for me.
Let me do that.
Yeah. And I'll just take my sweater off here. It's a bit warm here. Yeah, it was a really interesting creative process. I started in 2011, and the basic premise of the social media account, this is kind of in Twitter's more innocent days, was that I took a character, actually a real person, Tom Thompson, a landscape artist that died mysteriously in mysterious circumstances in 1917. And I just pretended he had a smartphone and that he was tweeting in real time in 1917. So I took all the historical detail. I did all the research. I recreated the timelines, and like, you know, I went back to the newspapers of the day. I went to the archives. I found all stuff about World War I, or the Great War at the time, and created very authentic tweets. And then I used a commercial scheduler, and I set them all up. And so the landscape artist was tweeting in real time, so to speak. And then one of the national newspapers picked up on it and did a feature article on it, and boom, like I had thousands of followers overnight. And then it just kept growing. And then I started to do this annual cycle. Like he would go from Toronto up to Algonquin Park in the spring of 1917, and then he would mysteriously die on July 8th, 1917. So I had everything all scheduled. The first year I used a commercial scheduler, and that worked okay. But then what I did was that I actually wrote my own with a, you know, with a Twitter bot, and got it all working, had my own database back end. And then what I did was kept refining the tweets, and I actually took the tweets and then I actually wrote them as journal entries, and I did that in real time in 2013, where I took my tweets and I would sit down and say, I got to pretend I'm the artist at night, and then I wrote realistic journal entries, and boom, that just went crazy as well. And then I took all that raw material, and then what I did was got a publisher and an editor, and then took all that material and then actually refined it and published a book. So let me just see. Yeah, if we got.
When you? It says you've started screen sharing, but I don't see anything yet.
Yeah, just hang on. It might be
Oh,
confused.
there you go. There you go.
Oh, am I there now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so yeah, just do you
That's
see
good.
the slide up there?
Yep, I
Yeah.
can see it now.
So the left-hand side is my presentable side. That's my official photo, and that's Parliament Hill, and that's the building I work at. And then, senior analyst, digital identity, Treasury Board Secretariat, all that good stuff. But on the right-hand side, this is my book, Tom Thompson, Journal of My Last Spring. I have my podcast called Definitely Identity. You can find it on Apple and Spotify and Google. And then I've written a chapter for an upcoming book on self-sovereign identity, co-authored with one of my colleagues that we've been working on how self-sovereign identity might be applied in the Canadian context. And I just thought, what the heck, I was cutting and pasting. I just put a picture of myself on Zwift as well. So it gives you an idea of the multifaceted aspect of what I'm doing. So I guess, for your students, I think a key thing for me, you never know where your career is going to go. You never know where your pathway is going to go. I never thought I would be into this kind of stuff, and I never thought I would become like one of the leading people. I get tons of consultations on this all the time. So yeah, and the other thing I've learned too is that while you can be really focused on professional stuff, it's really important to actually have pursuits that don't really have anything to do with your professional bearings. And that's what I did with the Journal of My Last Spring. So yeah, I took writing, like I had writing workshops, and it was a lot of work. Like you can write lots of raw material. That's the thing I learned, is that you can write lots of stuff on blogs and that, but it takes a lot of work to refine it and polish it into a book. And that's exactly what I've been doing over the past year, writing a use case chapter for self-sovereign identity, the book that will be coming out with Manning Publications. COVID-19 willing, later in August, I believe. That's when it will be coming out. So that's me in a nutshell. So York, where do you want me to go next? I guess
So
I'll ask.
what got you into this idea of self-sovereign identity? What were you thinking about?
Um,
And
how did
maybe you could just give a little bit of background on what that means.
Yeah, self-sovereign identity. Um, the way I would describe it, it's a different type of architecture, which cryptography is one of the key enablers. It actually puts some agency or control back into the hands of the user or the individual. And like the you had web 1.0 in the mid 90s up to the 2000s, which was basically really simple applications and websites and that. And then you started getting into what was called web 2.0, the user generated content, the user driven platforms, but they were really facilitated by the big like the Facebooks, Googles, Amazon, where they took advantage of the web 2.0 or user generated content aspect, and kind of co-opted that into like the surveillance economy that we're seeing today. And we can talk about that forever, but now we're starting to see a new architecture come about, especially enabled by things like asymmetric cryptography, where the control can go back into your hands of the individual. You have your private keys on your device, you can encrypt stuff, you can control stuff. And where that architecture was really proven out, I guess really where I started to get into it fairly deeply, I'm just going to, where I got into it fairly deeply was back in about early 2015, about five years ago, um, looking into the cryptocurrency, this blockchain thing, and trying to understand what was different about it, and you know, was it just a reinvention of the wheel, or was there something new about this architecture? And I went through, what was it, Antonopoulos's book. I went through that book and numerous other books, and just really kind of crunched it down to, the blockchain. It's actually more. It's more of a scheme. It's more of a set of cryptographic primitives that have been brought together, and what Nakamoto, whoever he was, really combined some existing cryptographic primitives in a new way, which is basically, asymmetric keys, uh, uh, hash algorithms, basically the proof of work, and based on hash algorithms, and actually brought that together into a scheme, or into an approach or consensus-based approach that no one actually could control on its own. So there was no single point of authority. And like every architecture up to that point in time, always required, especially if you're looking at massively scalable systems, in some respects, you need to have some sort of centralized authority, or centralized actor that may be going into it with all good intentions and with everything above board. But as soon as you have humans in the mix, you never know how those good intentions might be co-opted for other purposes. And I think that's what we saw, like the evolution of Google, for example, and Facebook. I don't want to point fingers and say that people are evil or companies are evil, uh, but the point was is that they realized that they could take what they had provided as a service, and actually turn that into a product for advertisers. And then I would say the more insidious thing that started probably about 5 years ago was that they could actually start influencing the behavior of the people. So you're seeing a lot of stuff around fake news and targeted content. And when those things add up, you have it happens institutionally. Like if institutions have an advantage, or people have an advantage, that accumulates over time, sometimes centuries. It's happened in history before, and this is where we got. I just remember, like, November 2016, completely shocked at the outcome of the elections. Nobody thought that was going to happen in the U.S. And we had issues here in Canada as well. Didn't play out that way. We were especially vigilant with our last election, but you realize that there's these new forces there, invisible forces that you may not be able to manage or control. So that's spawned a whole series of research. The University of Ottawa, the social science has a department, has actually really embarked upon a whole research agenda around the digital ecosystem, understanding that, what the influences are, what might be the impact on elections and democratic institutions. So there's a lot of effort on trying to understand what that environment is all about. So coming back to self-sovereign identity, I think, I know a lot of the original gang, so to speak. There's Drummond Reed, who is the co-author of the book, and also Phil Windley. There's a few other people as well. And I wasn't at there's a workshop, an internet identity workshop, that happens every 6 months in California. I've never actually been there, but I keep on top of it. There were discussions on how this technology, or how this approach might be used for identity. And I think it was Christopher Allen coined the phrase self-sovereign identity. A lot of people have issues with that term. Sovereign
Yeah.
doesn't give a good connotation. But if labels aside, you come back to that notion that individuals can have agency and control over their own information. Also, I know very well folks at Department of Homeland Security that's funding a lot of the research. Neil John, who's the director there, we're good friends. We go back several years. And I guess back in 2016, he and I started to look at this stuff very, very closely. And we keep in touch on the ongoing research. I look at it more from a strategic point of view. I'm always looking at it kind of like, this may sound like a corny analogy, but I used to be a tournament chess player. And I kind of look at it from the point of view, there's some new pieces on the board, the knight or the pawn, or there's some new rules, and let's try to understand these rules very, very deeply, even though the rules on the face of it might be very simple. Let's try to understand these rules very deeply, and how to understand how that might affect your strategy in a game, whether you play an open game or a closed game, and how that
Mhm.
affects your pieces. So I kind of look at it from that point of view, and try to understand self-sovereign identity, how it might impact not only the technology but the institutional frameworks, and how we might actually start rethinking how we have public sector or even private sector institutions. So I'm quite involved with you know, our within Canada, with the provinces and the territories. Again, coming back to policy, the policy development that I've been involved with, the thing that I've been focused on for the better part of 10 years or more than a decade is socializing the idea, especially to the large departments and agencies, I guess your equivalent of the Social Security Agency and the IRS, that they can actually rely on identity that's coming from the jurisdictions, that they can rely on
Mhm.
newer technologies, especially self-sovereign identity. That's where I'm very, very active right now. And it may cause them to rethink how they actually deliver their programs and services in a way that actually makes a difference for Canadians. Like my kind of cheesy mantra right now, I say it's not about the enterprise, it's about the ecosystem.
Mhm.
And that's the thing I'm saying now is like we're scrambling, especially with the COVID-19. Like we've all been sent home, and we're seeing all these products and software solutions that have been predicated on the enterprise as being the center of the universe. We're finding that those systems are actually breaking down or not scaling because everybody's outside the firewall, so to speak.
Mhm.
So we have to
Mhm.
start thinking about
Mhm.
how do we build things within an ecosystem and actually use components that you might not have direct oversight on, but you need to incorporate into your overall solution. And again, my training, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm not an electrical engineer or computer engineer. So the discipline that I come from, the training that I come from is like a couple hundred years old, and seeing a lot of same patterns evolve in the software industry, where you actually have to take technological components that you may not understand all the detail, but if you're designing a plane, you need to know the properties and the operating characteristics of it, and have ensure that the manufacturer that's providing you with that part can stand behind the quality assurance of it. And when you get into large scale software systems, it's not that different. You start treating things like empirical properties. So
Mhm.
you know, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. I don't know if it's good or not, but
Well,
I'll,
let me wind you back to something that you
yeah.
said earlier, which is um, you have a perspective, much like I do, that there's an importance in doing things that are outside the sort of your normal day job. And I think that type of, I think one of the characteristics of that is almost like a curiosity, which can drive you just to want to do, you know, continue to sort of dig down a rabbit hole on particular information sets. So one,
Yep.
I want to know if you sort of agree with that. But secondly, I'm also curious, when you went on this journey to sort of discover from the earlier days of blockchain and identity, how long did it take you to get sort of over your own hurdles in terms of understanding and really being able to get behind it?
Oh, still have a few of those hurdles to go over. Um, to give you an idea, like I like to understand everything down to the elements. And again, being an engineer by training, my view is that remember there was always a saying that I had, if you're actually going to design a solution or understand a math problem, you have to work it out on paper first. You have to go through, so you actually have the machinery in your mind to visualize how difficult something is. And I took that approach um, with understanding Bitcoin, or more blockchain, and more generally asymmetric cryptography. So, oh man, I guess about when I got into it, and I said, oh, I need to understand how this actually works. I need to understand the theory. Like you can talk about public keys and private keys and asymmetric encryption and wave your hands, pretend you understand. I went, oh, that's not good enough for me. So I basically bought a book on applied cryptography with all the number theory, and like hammered through the exercises on things like oh boy, I should know this off the top of my head, like doing all the things with primes and coprimes, and then going through the what are they called, the sets, the abelian sets, and the operations, and the going through the theorems. There's is it oh yeah, like did the Euclidean algorithm, the extended Euclidean algorithm. I did the the um, the algorithms, so you can actually figure out the factors. And then I went through and understood what phi was, and the significance of the prime numbers. And sorry, I'm doing this cold. I didn't prepare this part, but I went through that so that I can actually understand that. And then the other book that I started to go through, I'm only on chapter 4, is Jimmy Song's book on programming Bitcoin. It's really, really good. And once I had that base under me, I started to go through those exercises. And really, I was doing stuff with JavaScript and Node.js. Like I used to be a programmer way when back in the days of C and C++. I hadn't programmed for about 20 years, and I decided to get back into it. And then finally landed on Python and started to work through the exercises, and realized that the rabbit hole that I need to go down now is really understand Python at its very elemental. So I'm kind of given myself, so the path I was going down was doing all the elliptic curve cryptography, mathematical, and I got comfortable with that. And then I started to go down, well, I need to program it. So I went down Jimmy Song's book and worked through the exercises. And I realized, oh, my programming abilities need to be shored up. So now I kind of going back, and I'm actually literally working through a book from Manning Publications, which one is Tiny Python Projects, and I'm working through that and just doing that. The thing that I learned, and as I said before, if you really want to become a master of something, you actually have to do this stuff. You can't talk about it. And so you have to hand code the stuff. You have to try it out. On another aside, I'm a bit quirky, but a number of years ago, I kind of got onto the brain neuroplasticity kick, and was reading lots of stuff on that. And then I decided to pick up unicycling and juggling, and train myself to do that. And then I started doing, as I said, I go hardcore and stuff. I got into cross-country unicycling, where I go back roading on 40-kilometer trips on a unicycle. And so anyway, it's a bit quirky, but the thing is that um, this is the latest rabbit hole I'm going down with cryptography, Bitcoin blockchain, and now really putting my effort on self-sovereign identity. That's what people are calling it, but actually really trying to articulate the opportunity or the possibility of building an entirely new digital infrastructure. Like, quite frankly, I haven't been excited about this kind of stuff since about the mid to late 90s, when the internet really took off. You remember doing the ping on something, you're pinging an IP address and it goes back. It's kind of capturing that
Yeah.
time again.
So it
And
sounds like so two things. One, obviously, it sounds like you're your journey is never ending,
Yeah.
um, which I think is actually a really important trait on that I see in people who. That's why I use the word curious. Like if you're curious about things, you can be curious about anything. To your point about neuroplasticity
Yeah.
right. So it's such a phenomenal trait, especially for I think young people who are just starting out, like thinking about their journey and where their journey takes them. Right, curiosity is such an empowering tool. So, and when I tell my story, I always sort of time boxed my convincing of myself to about 6 months of like full-time study on top of my job. And I was sort of bounding it around, okay, when will I be comfortable sort of committing to this journey? And also when will I be comfortable trying to get other people to commit to this journey?
Yeah.
But so obviously we're both engineers, right? So we both look at it from a very technical perspective, but how do you actually how do you think about that same type of journey for someone who is a government policy worker or someone who's not technical at all?
You got to build the narrative. You got to work hard on building the story or the narrative, because that's how you parse the facts, and that's how you not necessarily convince people, like it's bring them along your journey. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing that I discovered again, writing a book is what people are always looking for. In a book or in a story or in a movie, there is always a narrative arc. A book, anything, a work of art is always about one thing. There might be two things on the page, there might be two subplots in the story, but it has to be about one thing. And that's the hard part, is to crystallize what that one thing is, and that's what hooks people. So, what I learned with the book that I wrote, it originally started out that I was tweeting this artist in real time that he died mysteriously. So I did all the research and got all the kind of the murder mystery clues and incorporated that. But Twitter, when I was tweeting it on Twitter and also with my blog, what I discovered, what really hooked people, was people wanted to have a relationship with this artist. They wanted to know him better. He died when he was 39. He's Canada's most celebrated artist, Tom Thompson. If you search him, you'll find like the iconic paintings of the Jack Pine and of the West Wind. Really, he gave Canada its voice in the world. This is back in the Great War in 1917, when we were sending men and material over to fight in the Great War. We really didn't have a say. And then before what was called the Battle of Vimy Ridge, our prime minister at the time demanded that he have say, or that Canada have say in the conduct of the battles. And there was a huge victory on April 9th of 1917, where there was a ridge that had been uh, that was held by the Germans for years, and it was the Canadians that finally broke through. So what I learned from that was that, and the artist, basically, he died in the midst of all this nation building. I don't know if that's the right term, but and the art that he was producing was so radical at the time that no, it was kind of like, we call him the Van Gogh of Canada. And when I was writing my book, I realized that what people wanted was a relationship with Tom. And so then when I really when I did my final, when I published the book and I worked with the editor, I spent a lot of time making it feel like he was writing it, and that's what captured people. So coming back to policymakers, you can get really sort of captured by a lot of dry stuff that doesn't make any difference. And I believe, and this is what I have been doing, is you have to come up with a narrative, a simple narrative, that's going to capture the upper echelons. And it takes, you have to experiment, and this is where Twitter is a fabulous method of doing it. Now I do have an image here. I'll flip it up. That I'll just share the screen so you can actually see it. This is the image that is really having some power. Let me see here. Where is my mouse? Can you see that?
Yes, yes. Actually,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, hit the wrong share button here. I'll just present. Yeah, so this is a narrative that I've come up with, is uh, this idea of Canada in the middle, and the notion of anchors and rails. And the anchors, you know, ties back to our maritime history, sea to sea to sea. And the rails is basically the reason we have a confederation, the reason we have the provinces that we have today, especially the province of British Columbia, is that we made a deal, or the federal government made a deal, that if you join Confederation, we will build a rail out to the province. And that's been the basic, you know, connector for the country. And then these are just some hokey, you know, visualizations or metaphors that the anchors of the trusted issuers, governments are trusted issuers of, you know, your identity, or it could be of currency, it could be of particular rights, and it could go on the rails for digital currency, digital claims, digital assets, and digital rights. And I use this visual, and I do have a Medium blog as well, where I experiment and try to come up with some narratives. I wrote last summer. I wrote a really good, well, in my opinion, really good blog about. A lot of you might have heard. I think it's was it Drucker, or about culture each strategy, or is that I forget who, one of the strategists saying that you can come up with a strategy, but culture is going to kill it in its own interest. And so I wrote a blog post talking about architecture eating culture eating strategy. And the historical analogy that I brought in was with the cathedral builders, like in the late Middle Ages, before the Renaissance period, when the notion of flying buttresses became, you know, I think that came from the Moors. They brought that notion of this external structure. So then what were like fairly flat, boring shoebox places of worship, you can actually build like more divine places of worship. And that actually affected how religion was conducted. And even after the religious stuff has gone away, you still have those architectures that stick around. So that's kind of the theme that I've been playing on. And when I'm coming back to digital architectures, like I think self-sovereign identity is an opportunity to build or construct a new digital architecture that shifts the balance of advantage or agency to the individual, so that they have control over their own information, and or more importantly over their own lives. So, you know, coming back to, you know, I think it's really important to not only have the technical acumen, but also to be able to express it in different ways. I've also, you know, just with the work that I did with the book that I had written, I had become quite a fan of like early 20th century poetry. Like we had the Confederation poets here in Canada. You're probably familiar with T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats and that, and just how they express and capture the times, especially after the First World War. It's captured in words, and I thought, wow, you know, words are really powerful. So, you know, when you're talking to policymakers, and you know, we're always involved with our strategic communications. We're always writing, you know, providing material that goes up the line for ministers, even to the prime minister sometimes. And you have to take something that's very complex and mundane and come up with some ways of expressing it in a way that actually resonate. And for me, that's really important, because that's how you get the buy-in, and that's how you get the energy flow from upwards to the downwards. Because the decision makers don't know what the hell we do. Like, they don't understand it, and they're actually relying on us to provide us with advice, the best advices that we can. And there's a notion that we have that as public servants, our job is to provide fearless advice, and um, uh, and provide the best advice as possible. And a lot of that is just not only understanding the environment and understanding the best that you can, and as honestly as you can, but then to be able to articulate that for the decision makers to understand. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, York, but
No,
that's just.
that was interesting. I actually I loved your journey into architecture, because I just got back from Barcelona before the lockdown, and gained such a new appreciation for Gaudi very explicitly because of his sort of forging new ground in terms of the buttresses and things like that, right?
Oh yeah, it blew me away. I was there a number of years ago. Familia Sagradi. Did you tour that cathedral?
Yes, yes.
What blew me away there was that thing's still under construction,
Yes,
and
I
it's.
had exactly the same thought, because like you look at like these historical monuments that were built over hundreds of years.
Yeah,
We really don't have any of those in our time, and
yeah,
that's an example of one.
yeah. That blew me away. I remember like going there, and it was like fresh concrete and freshly cut stone, and it's like stuff is brand new, and it looks like it looks like it's sacred. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That blew me away. It's in addition to the architecture.
So, how do you think about some of the ways that Canada is forging forward in terms of these new identity uh, structures, with things like being a trusted party for
Yep.
driver's licenses, and nation status cards and things like that?
Yeah, I've been in the center of that stuff for more than a decade, and really pushing hard now. Uh, and I've always been saying, like, what I'm doing is not really about technology; it's about institutional change management.
Hmm.
And as I said, I have been working on like the policy instruments that have socialized some new concepts. Like, we have some new policy definitions on what we call like trusted digital identity, trust frameworks. We have that in our Treasury Board policy instruments. So those are instruments that are approved by the Cabinet Committee. So in the Cabinet Committee are elected politicians who are ministers who are part of a select committee that is chaired by the president of the Treasury Board, which is like a kind of like the second in charge to the prime minister. So, working through that whole system to crystallize concepts and then actually have the rubric of authority on that, getting those in place. And I would say that was kind of like a decade in the making. We finally got our uh, instruments approved in July of last year, and then using that to operationalize. The other thing that I've been working on is the Pan Canadian Trust Framework. I think you have the links, and uh, we've been working on that. It's really using that as a tool to realize our policy outcomes, and the outcome um, that I would say, or the big change that we're managing, is that I'm sure it's similar in the U.S. that when you're dealing with the passport office, and when you're dealing with IRS, and you're dealing with Social Security Agency, you have to identify yourself separately in a different way. Or when you get your license from the DMV and you do anything with a particular city, it's all separate and it's all fragmented.
Hmm.
And sure, they may be successful within their own enterprise context, but it's a real hassle on you as an individual, because you have to do this stuff over and over again. So the idea that we're working through on Canada is that we want to make it as easy for Canadians as possible from their province where they live, BC, Alberta, Ontario, you name it. They should be able to have a digital identity from the province. And when they come to the federal government, we can actually accept that and let them into the benefits program as quickly as possible without asking them all those dumb questions over and over again. And that's really the essence. So on the change management side, on the with the large departments and agencies, we've had to say, look, we recognize that you're operating within your legislation and you're doing everything to risk manage within your context, but you got to realize that there's a larger context here, and there's the context of the country, the other jurisdictions, and the stuff that you do internally within your program. If we do this right, all that same stuff is already done within the province or territory. So let's set up an arrangement that we actually just accept that and rely on that, and actually have a system of accountability and agreement that you will accept that. So then you get all the legal folks involved. You get all the it's a real uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that I'd say we've been successful is resolve and fortitude, and saying, this is more of a change management exercise,
Mm-hmm.
and really kind of using the authority that we have from the center as a central agency, saying this is the direction that we want to go, and actually doing the hard work of convincing departments and agencies that this is the way to go. And it's a lot of it is collaboration, and well, it's always collaboration, but a lot of it's persuasion. But at the end of the day, it's just getting everybody onto the same page, and coming up with that narrative. Like, and we've had that for a long time, especially with identity. We've written papers from years ago. We're saying we want to give Canadians choice. The other thing too, which is a complete non-starter in Canada as in the US, there's just no way we're going to have a national identity card. No way we're going to have a national identity program. The separation of powers between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, even the cities in some respect, there's very clear separation. We might look like one country, but there's very different authorities and jurisdictions, much as like with the states and the federal level in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not going to give that up. And every state or every province has slightly different cultures, different circumstances, different history, different institutions. And despite that, coming up with a narrative or trajectory that everybody can buy into, and come together. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the other things that I do, I have a weekly working group call with the jurisdictions. I typically have 20 to 30 people from across the country representing all the jurisdictions, and I use that as an opportunity to advance the narrative. Like last week, just making it clear that with the pandemic, we have to come together as a country on this. We have to deliver. We have to make a difference for Canadians. Like as happening in the U.S., like we're coming up with emergency aid programs, like
Mm-hmm.
and the numbers that are applying for these benefits is the increase has been exponential. Typically, on a typical week, I think we have like something like applying for federal programs about 20 to 30,000 registrations. It went up to 1 million last week.
Wow.
You know,
Wow.
yeah. So we're trying to
Yeah,
figure out.
one of the yeah, and that exact example has been coming up in the U.S. like around a couple of things. One, in the U.S. Legislation, it was just agreed upon. They're actually excluding undocumented people, which obviously has a very negative
Yeah.
impact on a lot of immigrants. The So there's sort of two things that I think are interesting angles on this. One is one project that I'm advising is people thinking through how could I actually take a government payout that I don't really need myself, that I would like to give to someone, particularly someone who is unbanked. And
Yep.
how would you go about doing that, right? That's sort of one question. The other was actually around a very similar another population, which you could also call undocumented, unbanked, which is a homeless population,
Yeah.
right? And homeless, through some of the work that I'm doing, is very interesting case study, because you've got people living in society, um, with basically interactions with government in order to get services and potentially a path out of homelessness, and yet they don't have any real kind of identification.
Yep.
And one of the challenges there, actually, that we sort of discovered in one of these work areas, is that just having a recognition of a digital proof of authenticity of a document, or which otherwise you might call a notary, that if you
Yep.
could recognize that digitally, it would actually have a huge impact on being able to essentially have a digital ID system that could have those types of representations attached to it.
Yeah. And some of the issues there is that it's very difficult to make a profitable business model out of these things, and that's why
Mm-hmm.
we're more focused on working with the provinces and territories, because they have the duty to serve everyone in the jurisdiction, regardless of who they are. Um, the other thing that we're looking at as well, like I think it's similar in the U.S. We have a lot of indigenous communities that
Mm-hmm.
treaties that I think there's like 300 agreements, so we could have like 300 First Nations agreements as well. So we're just kind of keeping an eye on that as well. But I think there's I'm super sensitive to like the commercial opportunism that
Mm-hmm.
we have to really be wary of. Like not to criticize the U.S. health system, but per capita, you spend more on healthcare than we do in Canada, and we have a single payer system, and nobody here worries about going to the hospital. It just
Yeah, that's
happens, and it's just like when
this pandemic is a very strong lever demonstrating the challenges with the choices that the U.S. made in healthcare.
yeah, and um, we don't feel that pressure here. So I think uh, the thing is that understanding, like, another thing I like to say is that while identity is a private asset, it is also a public good, and we have to do this
Mhm.
in relation to the public good. So, we're involved with, as I said, I had discussions with with the Bank of Canada. They're basically the equivalent of the Federal Reserve,
Mhm.
looking at what might be strategies where we can bring identity and currency together. Not necessarily the same system, but they're involved in payment systems, large value transfer systems, settlement systems, and also how it might plug into or work with identity. We work with the Department of Finance, which does the regulations and oversight, and it's kind of a neat position that I'm in, and I get to see these initiatives. Another one that you might be aware of is I had discussion today, the World Economic Forum, the Known Traveler Digital Identity Initiative.
Mhm. Mhm.
We're involved with that with the Netherlands, and Transport Canada is our lead agency on that. And we're starting to have discussions to say, oh, maybe we need to repurpose this infrastructure for COVID-19. And there's a bunch of other things that are going on as well. So
Mhm.
the neat thing is I get to look at it from a country point of view, and provide advice, or at least provide some aspirational direction on what we should be doing as a country. And like coming back to what we said earlier on, I think regardless of what area that you're in, it's always good to have that curiosity and drill down and be passionate or obsessive about something, so you can provide the best advice that you can. And the kick I'm on right now is really understanding these new cryptographic architectures, understanding what the implications are, and what might be not only the technological implications, but I would say some of the institutional implications. So that's caused me to go back to read stuff about like the Reformation, the printing press, the alphabet, the telegraph, the radio, these technological disruptions. And if you can find some good history books on that and read about how, like, Lincoln in the Civil War, he was the first one to figure out how to move men and material around with the telegraph and the trains. Totally changed the face of battle. Up to that point, battle was just like a bunch of soldiers on a local field. They fought it out, and then the report would go back. But Lincoln figured out how to be strategic, and that's where the notion of the war room came from. So not so sure how these elements play out in this environment, but we know that there are some of those new chess pieces on the board that we need to understand and either defend against or attack with.
Mm-hmm. The chess analogy is very, very interesting. I always sort of look at, obviously chess is a, sort of a long strategy game. And I always think of it in a very simplistic form, having not been trained as a chess player. In that, although I can beat my son who's trained as a chess player, probably because I'm so I play in such a chaotic way.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of the ability to think many steps ahead of the implications, right, of particular current moves and how they will have an implication down the road.
Yeah, and I always keep thinking, like, I feel like I got this big chessboard in front of me. I got Canada, and I'm always thinking through like the jurisdictions, also thinking about what's going on. We're involved with like an organization called the Digital Nations. We have the other countries like Estonia, Korea. Let me see. I think there's 10 countries at last count, like Uruguay and that. Just understanding what's going on in those countries. I've try to understand what's going on in the highly adjacent area of digital currency and identity, and kind of try to synthesize that into a picture. And one of my fave examples is the plan for D-Day, the biggest military, or I think it was the biggest military mobilization in history. Montgomery had a one-page plan on what to do. If you just Google it, you'll find it, and that was basically the plan for the D-Day invasion. And so I'm always a big fan of being able to dial things back to one visual or one model. It's got to be about one thing and one thing only, and then from that you can actually elaborate your models from that. And coming back to blockchain, with all the complexity in that, I've really boiled it down to it gives two new capabilities to build new institutions around. This notion of what I call anchoring, which you don't have in the digital world today, is being able to anchor proofs outside of your system. So you need that for long-term viability. And then this notion of ordering timestamps or ordering of transactions. You need to have that. I don't like to call it truth. You just need to have a convention or something that you can come back to. And I'm finding you can actually bring everything back to those two capabilities. If you can have that, what's the term, exogenous or outside of your system, and build a global capability, that's going to change the game. And then you can add on the asymmetric cryptography and all that stuff. You can build that on top of that architecture.
Where is, out of curiosity, the Digital Nations group? Is there a URL for that?
Yeah. I think if you search for Digital Nations, you'll find it. They changed the URL. We assume the presidency of it just this year, and it used to be called the D5, then it was the D6, the D7, and then Denmark joined, and they said, screw it, let's just call it Digital Nations. It was too hard. Yeah, yeah, I can find it. the Twitter handle, I believe, is Digital Nations. Yeah, the Twitter handle is Digital Nations,
Mm-hmm.
and then the site is Leading Digital Govs. But if you just you can find the yeah, it's leadingdigitalgovs.org.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm on a thematic group of digital identity. We have a monthly call, and we're just comparing notes on what we do in different countries and looking at pilot projects. And one of the things that I've been really advocating for is the verifiable credentials and digital identity, and we're looking at proofs of concepts in that space.
Great. And how, well, I'll come back to this digital nations thing another
Sure.
time. It's interesting. Are you also doing any work with the OECD at all, or no?
Yeah. There's I'm just trying to think. Is Untitled? There's Untitled. I know they've done some um, model legislation,
Mm-hmm.
and the OECD. I know we've always we provided input into their reports and that, and I think one of our other uh, departments, innovation, science, and economic development, is really leading on that. I know that they're doing something on. There was a blockchain principles or something like that that we had to provide input into.
Yeah, I'm
And
actually on their blockchain, whatever they call it, expert
okay,
panel or something.
yeah, okay, yeah. I know. I've seen stuff and have tried to provide input through the agency or department that's really the lead on that. So, there's the OECD, World Economic Forum. There's
Mm-hmm.
ISO's doing tons of stuff as well. I've been putting my energy in to where I see like, where some of the real tech is being developed. Again, um, there's Department of Homeland Security, the
Mm-hmm.
Silicon Valley Innovation Program. There's a bunch of research projects going on. I put together a innovation solutions challenge. We're just going to be awarding that shortly. We had about 40 respondents, and we're going through them and evaluating them. Yeah, there's tons of stuff going on. It's really, my issue is where do I want to focus to make a difference on this stuff,
Yep.
and that's always the big challenge. And
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting perspective, and I think it also very much sort of falls into how you think about like your role. I mean, one of the things that um, sort of some of the choices that I make around how I spend my time is I think about like what are my goals, and then where can I have the biggest impact on achieving those goals. Um, and so when I think about this in the context of something like blockchain and potentially even digital identity, um, my ability to use my day job at Microsoft as a platform is probably one of the biggest platforms that I could have. And so,
yeah,
as much as like, people would want me to go work somewhere else, in a lot of ways, I hold on to that because there's such an importance in terms of the platform. And the other thing that's actually interesting about Microsoft that's very different than many other tech providers. You mentioned a couple earlier, like Facebook, Google, to some extent, even Amazon, is we're actually relatively not conflicted in terms of trying to. Well, we don't have a business model, right, that monetizes personal identity data. Um, and so that's actually a very interesting non-conflicted place to be thinking about something that's so transformative, where we're basically saying that the consumer should own and control their personal identity data.
yeah, yeah. The way I've been describing Microsoft is that I feel that their heart's in the right place, and maybe need some help on moving away from the enterprise model. And
Mhm.
I think you're doing that well. Like uh, it's always interesting. Like again, I'm a bit of a student of strategy too, to see the strategic moves that Microsoft is making. For example, we just acquired NPM, and you have GitHub, and so I think you're realizing, or Microsoft's realizing, like the open source is, and these community driven efforts are the way to go in the future in terms of software. And I think you're starting to see that enterprise proprietary software will eventually go away,
Yeah.
and Microsoft has like the wherewithal to strategically pivot. It might take a few years, but
Yeah.
it sounds like there's some pretty smart strategists that kind of know what's going on there. And
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I actually, on public record a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, first sort of stating that I actually think that within 10 years, Microsoft would potentially be out of the proprietary software game, and fully. I mean, we're actually quite fully embracing open source, but I think if you think about some of our businesses, whether it's Dynamics, ERP and CRM tooling, or Office, right? Those are still commercial proprietary software
oh
products. Right?
yeah, I say government's been one of the worst victims. I say we've been spending the last 30 years crawling out of these big IT captures. We've got to get out of this, and we've got to look at new ways of doing things. And uh, I really can't say too much, but now with the COVID-19 crisis, we're getting all these unsolicited proposals, and we've had to set up a triage group. And the big flags that I've raised is that we have to be very careful, especially with our large departments and agencies, that they don't get locked into something because of an
Right.
expedient decision. So on high alert for that kind of stuff. But I think you know I've been watching stuff that Microsoft has been doing in the identity space, and you know I'm I'm comforted. Maybe that's not the right word, but
Mhm.
it's like, okay, yeah, that's going in the right way. I'd love to have a more frank conversation with some of your executives on kind of what our approach will be in Canada. Like
Mhm.
we're making it very clear that we are going open standards and open source as best we can, and and basically we're not going to be captured by enterprise proprietary software. Like
Mhm.
it's just not going to happen.
Yeah,
And
I think so. I'll take you up on that. I think it
yeah,
would be great to set up some discussions, around that strategy, both with open source and also with identity. You probably know some of the identity folks like
oh
Daniel
yeah,
and
yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
Encore. But I also think it's worthwhile for the executives to hear the perspective, right? Particularly from someone who speaks right on behalf of large institutions.
yeah. And the analogy that I give, coming back to like chess and hockey or whatever, is that let's figure out this game and let's figure out where the boundaries are. And none of us crossing the boundaries and dipping into the stuff that we should be doing. And that's our duty as holders of the public trust. Don't get into that space. Provide us with something as best you can, but don't do it in your own particular interests at the expense of the public interest.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm not afraid to like uh, um, uh, call an executive on the carpet on that stuff.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think they have to realize that that's the bargain that governments are driving now. And our former CIO, he's moved on, but that was the bargain that he was driving as well. And we've picked up those cues. And again, for me, I used to be on the other side. I was in the software industry. I was in product management. I worked in enterprise sales. I know exactly how these tactics work,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
we're on high alert when we hear like that there's been discussions at the ministerial level, at the senior management level, and I'm not afraid to call them out on it.
Well, great. Let me,
And yep.
this has been a phenomenal discussion. I want to make sure that if people have burning questions, that they have an opportunity to ask some questions before we wrap up and take a break. So I'm opening it up to the floor, everyone. I think everyone is here. I know we're running a little bit late for our normal break, but hopefully, given the remote circumstances, that's a little bit better. So what questions might someone have? Here, Tim, I'll give you a picture of Sagra Familia.
So I read your article on digital identity in relation to like Google Duplex. How
Yeah.
So I guess like how does like digital identity and everything like play into AI specifically?
Oh, okay. So to me, the biggest existential threat is that you don't know what's real at the other end of the line. And what really shocked me with that is that, you know, there's what we call the Turing test of whether it's human being or not. There is a real threat that your perception of reality is being shaped by these platforms unbeknownst by you. And the only way that you can actually guard against that is to be able to is to be able to preserve human judgment in a way, and human judgment and human perception as it goes across these digital mediums. And maybe I'm not expressing myself well, but the thing is that what really got me is the ability for our realities to be altered and gamed. And so your perception, probably what you see on your Twitter feed or your ad feed, is different than me. I see it with my boys. I have 3 teenage boys, and their reality is completely different than mine. I can't believe the stuff that they. I'm just shocked at their different reality than what I have. Mm-hmm. And it's just there's going to be unseen forces, for better or for worse, that can actually take advantage of that. And there's work being done that was actually recognized, especially after the 2016 elections. We just had our election last October. There was a full-on effort to protect against that with the Canadian elections. Like there was a lot of really good work done on disinformation. Our intelligence agencies, like, you know, the Soviets figured out how to do this 50 years ago. They just got new technology at their disposal the last decade or so.
Right.
And yeah, they figured this stuff out a long time ago, but they had new vectors to take advantage of. So it really, I think AI, it can construct these realities that that we rationally might say, no, that's fake, but viscerally we react against it. And so, you know, it's just something that we just have to be very wary of as a threat. It's just convincing me to shop somewhere else, or convincing me to have an ill feeling against someone, or convincing me to be biased without me knowing it. You do that at a nation scale, you can add that up and cause some real damage.
Yes, we've seen the damage.
Yeah.
I actually wrote, I don't know if you saw my CoinDesk opinion column piece specifically on this problem. I mean, it was a sort of a minor piece, but it was basically about this idea of information overload, you know, and essentially the ability to manipulate reality right through people's ability to discern what's actually valid information versus skewed opinions. And AI is actually pretty insidious, because the challenge with AI is that the power of AI outstrips a human's ability to reason at the speed that AI can reason. And so AI it's actually hard to understand how you would check like the validity of the results from some kind of AI algorithm.
So we have a group within our agency that's been involved with coming up with ethical guidelines for ethical AI. And one of the key issues is that even with your data sets might have bias in them, and you're just basically communicating that bias, and you might not even know it. And yeah, it's we could probably spend a whole session on that, but it's just, I think the key thing is to be aware of it and to be cognizant of it, and reflect. And the way that that I kind of deal with it is again going down some rabbit holes. One American philosopher that I've actually become quite interested in is Richard Rorty, which talks about different ways of like dealing with communicating differences and debating differences, and relativism, so to speak. So I think treating things not as a way to influence each other, but actually to have a conversation that moves forward in everyone's benefit. So I think the solutions are not necessarily just technological or anti-technological. There's some human discourse to be had in moving this forward.
Agreed. Anyone else have a question they would like to ask? Everyone's getting hungry for their dinner, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Did you have a question, Victoria?
I was just gonna say, like, I feel like some of the stuff that I was reading, I would like to hear more about, like, how this impacts privacy and how much information, like, we're actually letting everyone see about us, or if this gives a consumer a little bit more of a shield.
Yeah, so in terms of privacy, I'm seeing the conversation shift to digital rights. And it's more than just privacy. It's about how you express yourself digitally. And we're seeing that, like in Canada, we have, again, another department has taken the lead on developing the digital charter. And we're looking at revising our privacy legislation. And we have our Department of Justice is putting together some discussion papers on this as well. I don't consider myself an expert in privacy, but we're certainly seeing like an evolution of the debate. So that's what I can add on my limited expertise on privacy, is that we may need some new reconceptualizations of what privacy means in this new environment.
Yeah, and I mean, I think where we are today is, as consumers, we've given up a tremendous amount of data about ourselves, and we continue to do so. And laws like the GDPR law out of Germany is really specifically focused on allowing consumers to demand their data back, and then providing something that's often called consent when data is used in a specific use case with very specific parameters. That law is actually having, or that regulation is having an impact worldwide, because anybody who needs to any vendor that needs to comply with that in one country, to some degree, might as well do it in all countries. And so it actually is having some positive impact in terms of how people think about their personal digital identity and data associated with it. So I think there is a systemic change that has to happen around that. I don't know. What's your impression of GDPR and the impact of that?
Personally, I'm not a big fan of GDPR. Like I like what it's doing, but What I don't like is like pushing the notion of consent explicitly on individuals. And what happens is that organizations figure, well, if we ask for consent and we get consent and our job is done,
Right.
and maybe we can ask for a few extra things about consent, well, for third parties, and that job is done. And the analogy that I give is that just imagine if every drinking fountain that you came to had like a consent saying, if you drink this, you agree to be, you know, you have to read this terms and conditions. And we got to make it as simple as safe drinking water. And I think there has to be a general code that everybody abides to, that observes the rights of individuals. And I think individuals, regardless of who they are, should feel safe in getting a service without having to go through this sort of cognitive load of risk managing every interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And in my view, what happens is that you know, that gets gamed. Like it's like every website I go to asks me something, and it's either accept or give all my information to third parties. Never used to be that way, and then you feel like every time you go to a new website, you just bargained your life away, and it's just not acceptable. So I think that's, we have to start looking at it in a new light, and I think it has to be back to the level of like human rights, and just saying this is we did it for the physical realm. Now we need to do it for the digital realm, and we have to come up with a set of rights that basically this is how it's got to be done. I'm not optimistic it could be enforced, but I'm optimistic that if we can actually put in like what I call hard controls with cryptography, and actually have those hard boundaries, there may be an ability to do that. So I think there's like lots of opportunity for some like take no prisoners, go back to the drawing board thinking on this, and how we've been doing it for the latter part of the 20th century and the early 21st century is we can all go back to the drawing board and look at it in a completely new light.
Right. Well, and I agree with that. So I think you're answering Victoria's question in some ways, saying that yes, there is an opportunity with these new digital identity and cryptographic constructs where you could actually just shut it down, right? And start by saying, okay, now basically nobody gets anything, and then it has to be very explicit what they do get. The other point that you made is that you see now basically almost every website you go to is now asking for you to accept something or okay something, right? And what they're effectively doing is responding to new legal concerns about the terms and conditions that they never had to ask you about before, which were on their websites, that said they could share your data with like any of their third-party network, right? Right. And so now when you come to every website, they're now asking you, is it okay if I do that, right? Which, to your point, is more cognitive load even than I can handle. I just usually say okay, right?
Yeah. And I think where my thinking is that the only way we're going to practically combat this is with some hard cryptographic controls, zero trust architectures, selective disclosure, and that's hence the deep study that I'm doing on this, so that when a website is demanding something of me, I give them what they need and no more.
Right. Anyone have a last parting question they'd like to ask?
Sure. So
go ahead, Merce.
Oh, I was going to ask, so if they're going to go more strict with GDPR, what do you think about these apps like Sweatcoin? Because I know like Sweatcoin, because it's like an app, you get coins when you're walking around and getting your steps in, but it does also track your location. Like it literally maps out where you have been this whole time and sells to the third parties. But there are also other apps who does like very similar things, like essentially tracks your location. Even they were talking about now how in NYC, we have tap, like we just tap to go into the metro station. They said like how they're actually also checking that out as well, like from one station to another, so they can work on your daily commute, so they can start working on the advertising based on your daily commute, like where you have been going?
Oh, great.
Well, basically, your phone operating system architectures are predicated on tracking you. And that's the business model for Android. Google figured that out years ago. Apple picked up on that as well. So you basically have these tracking devices in your pocket, and they're architected for that. So I think that's just the reality of it. And there's lots of stuff going on in those phones that you don't even know about. And I am hoping that eventually that there will be new hardware architectures that will prevent that. And there's some interesting handset manufacturers like HTC. HTC Exodus is actually designing a phone that actually segments and compartmentalizes the architecture. So I think for the short term, we've kind of signed our lives away with these devices here. And hopefully we can get like Apple and Google to cooperate with us. I'm hoping at the government level at least. But I think there's a real opportunity to develop, as I said, those hard controls, not only in software, but in hardware as well. It'll probably take a full generation of devices for that to happen. But I think that's where we have to go. Like you're starting to see that like with hardware wallets. There are architectures, there's some interesting papers coming out about how to segment and reduce the attack surfaces on devices and that. There's a lot of really smart people working on this. I can't even begin to talk about it, but I think eventually, you know, these operating systems, hopefully they will be replaced by something that respects us as human beings eventually.
Because you have the same problem with apps, right? Like if you're gonna, when you launch a new app, it asks for, you know, access to your contacts, your camera, your, you know, all kinds of things, right? That doesn't necessarily need, although, you know, if you're gonna load a picture up, right, then it certainly at a point in time needs access to your camera.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's the same, this exact same problem with websites, right? I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
You know, in a different form. Anyone else? All right, well then let's call it. Thank you so much, Tim, for entertaining us, for a great
Yep.
long discussion, and just fascinating how many rabbit holes you're down.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me. Like I'm on Twitter and Medium blog. I do have my podcast. Sort of the pandemic kind of put a damper on it, but hopefully I'll get back into the groove again. So stay safe, everyone, and thanks so much for the privilege of having me, York. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thanks so much, Tim. Talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
So we'll take let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll be back at, I'll give you a couple extra minutes, 10 minutes after the hour. And we'll continue on with the rest of the class at that point.